Afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Those of you in person, welcome to those of you online, which is a convenient way of saying this is being broadcast or simulcast online. It'll be also recorded, as you may have just heard, and it will be posted on the PEPG website sometime probably next week for anybody who wants to review what you may have missed, but also for folks who may have missed it and aren't here today or watching online. But I do want to welcome you all for being here. This is our third session of the spring semester as part of the Education Policy Colloquium series sponsored by the Program on Education Policy and Governance. My name is Jim Pizer. Up until recently, I was the Massachusetts Secretary of Education, where I served for about 8 years in the Baker administration. And now I'm currently an academic visitor here at the Kennedy School with PEPG, working with Paul Peterson and Marty West, who's with us today. I don't know if Paul's online. Paul's online too, so wherever you are, Paul, hello, to help organize the semester's Colloquium series. At the moment, we've got 4 more sessions scheduled, and for those of you in the room, there's a sheet with the schedule. It's on the website, on the PEPG website. And we've got some really outstanding topics and scholars who are going to be part of this series before April runs out. And the next session in particular is in 2 weeks. Is it 2 weeks or 3 weeks? 3 weeks, March 30th. Thursday, March 30th, when Emily Hanford, the senior correspondent with American Public Media and the creator of the viral podcast Sold a Story, will join us for a discussion on the ongoing controversy around the science of reading with a session entitled Learning to Read Beyond the Politics. So this will be a really important and fascinating session, and I hope you all can join us, so mark your calendars. The topic for today might be a little less controversial, but it's no more timely and important. For many years now, there's rightly been a focus in K-12 on preparing young people for college, especially low-income students of color who have been underrepresented in higher education or have been underprepared for success when they get there. That work, of course, goes on. But recently, there has also been more and more attention paid to developing new and expanded career pathways, both for students who are planning to go directly into the workforce, but also those who may be pursuing post-secondary education that is more sort of occupationally focused. These initiatives build on a solid track record of success in vocational technical schools or career technical high schools in terms of graduation rates and other indicators such as postgraduate employment and earnings. So the question is really how to maximize access and impact to technical education while reducing disparities, given the constraints related to things like public revenues, qualified teachers, and the changing demands of employers. We're lucky today to be joined by Professor Shaun Dougherty, who's a professor of education and policy at the Lynch School of Education at Boston College, who's been studying these questions deeply, including in places like Massachusetts and Connecticut and elsewhere. And among his areas of expertise and research is the economics of education, with an emphasis on career and technical education. Importantly, at least for today, Shaun also has some Harvard connections, having earned his doctorate here and serving as a strategic data project faculty advisor through Harvard Center on Education Policy Research. After his presentation, we should have ample time for questions and answers and discussion. As I said, we're streaming this live, so we've got folks online. We will give priority to folks who are in the room in terms of asking those questions, but I'll try to make sure that folks online through Zoom, either through the chat or by raising your hand with that function, get recognized as well, so we can have everyone as fully involved as possible. So with that, it's my pleasure to turn the program over to Dr. Shaun Dougherty. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim, for Marty for helping to spur the invitation and the opportunity for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon and talk a bit about my research. For this, great. Okay, here come the slides. I'm going to try to cover a lot of territory, and rather than go deep on one study, I'm trying to do a step back and frame big picture how we might think about the research from the last 20 years, and especially most recently in assessing the state of career and technical education, youth pathways to adulthood, ways of navigating those pathways, and from a policy standpoint, especially thinking state and local policy, what are the opportunities and challenges in thinking about making this work as optimally as possible. No worries. Okay, so as Jim suggested, the evidence increasingly points to the realization that career and technical education can really smooth the transition to workforce and to some extent to college, and certainly to and through the high school process in ways that we didn't previously have strong causal evidence. For a long time, we've known that there's an economic payoff to career and technical education, but I'll get into some of the nuance there in this talk. Policy has been innovating very quickly. The research, per usual, is not keeping up with the innovation quite as quickly, and so that's part of the reason I'd like to do some synthesis in this talk and stepping back from a variety of studies. So we've got this evidence, we've got political will, but we're also facing challenges around how best do we scale access to career and technical education? How do we think about the fact that there are different costs, financial costs associated with offering different programs? How do we think also about the fact that career and technical education faces similar constraints on the teacher workforce to other high demand areas? And then how do we think about meeting educational and workforce goals in ways that are complementary? So I'll try to pull this all together in the context, and I've tried not to make too many slides. So in many instances, I've got one slide that synthesizes several months or in some cases a year's worth of work. So I'm happy to unpack it if it's of interest. So interrupt, please, with questions as you have them. So first, I'll also say that I'm going to focus on career and technical education as it happens in US high schools. We can talk about post-secondary education. I will inevitably talk about the transition to post-secondary education as outcomes of interest, but not as the seat of where CTE happens, though CTE happens, especially at community and technical colleges around the country. So conditioning on high school, I also want to say, if I say career and technical education, what am I talking about? There are at least three different ways or places that career and technical education happens in US high schools. Comprehensive high schools being like, residentially assigned schools where students take electives in conjunction with state requirements for high school graduation. That would be the third column there, comprehensive high schools. That's where most students are going to have the most global access. In the middle, I have regional centers. So you can think about this model, I think, is the most common outside of comprehensive high schools nationally, where students from multiple districts have a regional technical center. They spend half their day in their comprehensive high school, roughly half their day at the regional center, where they go to get specialized elective training. And then there are whole school models of CTE where students apply to, in many instances, or enroll in a model of schooling where everyone who enrolls in the school is taking a high concentration of career and technical education electives as the bulk of their non-state graduation requirement coursework, and has the integration of work-based learning, employer partnerships, other things that in principle exist across all three settings, but are differently integrated. At the rows in this table are meant to be different dimensions of the CTE experience. This is my general mapping. This is not like immutable, so I'm open to argumentation around whether and how different elements of this might exist in places where I have not put X's. The key thing I think to point out at the bottom, these are estimates based on a variety of slightly out of date, but latest available NCS statistics on where students enroll in CTE. Roughly 2/3 are across the country enrolling in regional technical centers, part-time centers. About 1/3 exclusively at their comprehensive high school, and the smallest fraction in the whole school model of CTE. So like the regional technical schools in Massachusetts, or the Connecticut technical education system in Connecticut. New York has some models like this, New Jersey does, but once you get out of that sort of Northeast corridor, you quickly move to states like Pennsylvania, Delaware, Arkansas, where regional centers are the norm, or electives in comprehensive high school. So just for table setting, this is sort of what it looks like in broad terms and where it happens.
And what percentage of high school students do those shares represent, like overall? Those are the percentage of CTE students in different models of CTE.
Yeah.
What share of high school students overall are in a CTE program?
So nationally, there's discussion about this. Between 80 and 90% of students take at least one credit in CTE.
Right? Yeah.
I don't think it's a super helpful statistics. I'm parroting it because I've read it a lot, but most of this is happening unwittingly. You take a business course in high school, you've taken a CTE course. You take a course in family and consumer science, but like without necessarily intent. So students who will meet the definition for being a concentrator, so taking 2 or 3 courses in a line program of study, falls off pretty fast from there. That I don't know the national average offhand. In Massachusetts, it's about 20%. In Michigan, it's about 50%. Similarly in Tennessee. In Arkansas, I think it's about 40%. In Connecticut, it's north of 20, but well shy of 50. So there's a lot of variation across states. And some of that is a function of the differences in the economic structure and opportunities.
And then these shares are of all those students, including like my son who's in an entrepreneurship course at Newton North right now, but is not a CTE student. Like, so it seems like he's in a comprehensive high school.
Yeah.
And so the like comprehensive high schools may be overrepresented here relative to their share of the students who are really in a
Yeah, that are like concentrating,
Yes.
fulfilling a concentration. I suspect that could be. I suspect if I had the numbers on hand, my bet would be the regional centers producing the largest fraction, both of enrollees, but also of concentrators. Okay, so in addition to,
don't worry about it.
okay, all right, thanks. So this is also policy context that many of you might have, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the sort of, as Jim mentioned at the outset, the shift from a college for all to thinking about college and career readiness, just expanding more explicitly the acknowledgement that there are multiple ways to get from high school to some sort of permanent work or shifts in your work over time, has then meant that schools can think more expansively about what they're prioritizing, valuing in ways that differed from the previous 20 years. We also, an area of bipartisan support like early childhood education, the Perkins Act that provides federal funding for state CTE was reauthorized in 2018. A couple of consequential features there. In the short term, it lowered the threshold for what counts to be a concentrator, thereby making it possible to have more concentrators and potentially more federal funding in places where students are taking at least 2 or 2.5 aligned courses in a program of study. Also, with the latest reauthorization, there's a greater emphasis on in-demand fields. And so specifically where there's the highest level of employment, high employment growth, or high wage industries that align with career and technical education, meant to be a more explicit focus. And that I highlight here because it, I think, has implications, or I know has implications for the way programs are being staffed and structured in schools as schools think about expanding. And the Workforce and Innovation Act sits at the sort of intersection of all of this about workforce development, education, and the workforce as the most explicit linkage there. Okay, so I'm going to quickly go through a few slides that thinks about or talks about the evidence on what CTE is impacting. So there's a number of studies now in career academy models, in comprehensive high schools in California, and in specialized high schools in Massachusetts, whole school models of CTE in Massachusetts and Connecticut, where we see large positive impacts on high school completion. So going from a non-high school graduate to a high school graduate. In Connecticut, we find the effects are particularly large for boys. In Massachusetts, I found they were especially large for students who are free and reduced price lunch eligible or coded as economically disadvantaged, but pretty clear evidence of impact in those settings. We find equivocal evidence in New York City in very recent work. Similarly, CTE dedicated high school models, but the outcomes are as good and relatively high for New York City. Some work is finding improved learning outcomes. So it's long been a part of the theory of action of CTE that workforce outcomes would be improved when you have education that's focused on developing skills that are relevant for the workforce. However, in Connecticut, in Massachusetts, in North Carolina, we find evidence that scores on state standardized tests required for graduation are as good or better for students who get into these specialized high schools or career academies. And then also consequentially in thinking about the link between what drives better graduation outcomes. We see that engagement in ninth grade, which is sort of a important transition point. We know from other research on dropout, measures of engagement have been shown to be enhanced in ninth grade at technical schools. All right, it's not, maybe I'm pressing the wrong button. No, it's all right. There we go. All right, well, let's talk about workforce then. As I mentioned, there's been longstanding evidence that CTE improves employment and earnings. Most of that evidence came from a period where we couldn't have strong causal attribution, but now in a number of studies, we've seen pretty strong evidence that even under pseudo-random access to CTE, we see really large positive impacts on earnings, at least through mid-20s, so 5 to 7 years out of high school. And more recently, we've been able to pinpoint in Connecticut, where the effects were especially large for boys, that some of this is about industry sorting. There's really gendered patterns of who takes what program in CTE, and the economic returns are differential by program orientation. For instance, construction, manufacturing, and automotive or auto mechanics pays really well. Education and care tends to pay less well, and there are really gendered patterns of sorting there. However, in more recent work, we found that even like net of these gendered patterns of sorting into programs and related impacts, conditional on being in the same program, we didn't find such big differences in impacts by gender. So for boys and girls in a binary world where students are enrolled in advanced manufacturing program, the returns on those investments were equally good. However, the fraction of female identifying students in those programs was substantially smaller than males.
Shaun, how do you?
Yeah.
So one of the concerns that people have about CTE education is people like Rick Hanishek and others have argued that like it might ease your transition into the labor market and give you an earnings advantage early on, but then as things change, you're less of a generalist and you do less well over the course of your career. How seriously do you take that concern? And do we have any evidence from the US that speaks to it?
Yeah, so I definitely take the concern pretty seriously. We don't have anything comparable to work like what Rick has done on like, career-long impacts. I've got a slide in a little while that shows if we take what we know through age like 25 or 27 and make some assumptions about like those effects fading out by age 45, would it still lead to a net benefit? I mean, I'm doing the public accounting, which is more conservative. From a private accounting standpoint, I think the answer is clearly yes. However, from 45 to end of life, hopefully there's a good long chunk of time for most people. And that's where we don't have great evidence about, can you take your general skills and pivot across your working career in the ways that you likely will have to? I'd say the good news, however, is in some of the evidence, at least in these specialized high schools, we're finding benefits on general skills that weren't necessarily part of the working hypothesis or theory of change for CTE a generation ago, that if in fact we're improving learning outcomes, the test score gains specifically, and the sort of changing nature of work in some of these industries that like maybe we're not as concerned about general skills as we might otherwise have been. So I'm just demonstrating some of the magnitude of the wage gains. We see like a 30% increase in total earnings by age 23 in this technical high schools in Connecticut, but also in average quarterly earnings. So it's not just that you're accumulating more years of work, but the kind of per quarter compensation conditional on continuing to be employed is higher for graduates of these technical high schools. So on college going, the evidence is more ambiguous. There's work 15 plus years ago on tech prep programs that showed some smoothing of transition from high school into two-year colleges using broad national data. Increasingly, there's evidence that technical high school does align with college going, but the answer to the question, like does CTE improve college going, is just ask some more questions from I think a reasonable policymaker standpoint, which is the program intended to go to college? If you're in a plumbing program and we find that you're disproportionately enrolling in four-year colleges, we probably should think twice about what's happening in the plumbing program or who's enrolling. On the other hand, if you're in a healthcare field, if you're in IT, if you're in engineering, there are clear pathways into 2- and 4-year colleges that align with the occupations, that align with that training. And so anyway, I'll unpack a little of this to
Quick question.
please.
I'm not sure exactly how some of the academic standards play out in other states, in particular, whether if you're at a CTE school, you're expected to essentially take the same curriculum as basically everyone else in public schools, or whether there are certain subjects you don't have to take as much of, or the expectations are lower, so that you're actually not having the same academic experience that you would have if you were in a typical high school.
Sure. So you know better than I, but in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York City, it's the case that you have to satisfy. You have to pass the Regents in New York. You have to pass the MCAS in Massachusetts. You have the same graduation course requirements in Connecticut. There are some states that have thought about modifying, for instance, math requirements or science requirements to be applied math or applied science that would dovetail specifically with CTE coursework. I won't name them offhand the instances where I know, because I don't know the details of it, but that is sort of a question, kind of whether and how there could be substitution there. And it speaks to Marty's question about the general skills and the potential longer versus shorter term implications, I think. Yeah,
Right.
but in the context where I've been doing research, that what you see is, in fact, my colleague Walt Ecton at Florida State did some work with the Massachusetts data that dovetails with findings from Connecticut, where we see mostly what's happening is substitution away from world language courses or other arts and music electives that students would take in high school in favor of CTE courses. And so whether you're in a comprehensive high school or a CTE dedicated high school, that's really what we see. And in the Connecticut schools, we see that world languages just aren't offered. Instead of 5 languages, there's 1 language, and there are just lower enrollments in that 1 language versus 5 languages at the residentially assigned comprehensive high school.
Sure.
Please.
A quick question. Just curious about we might have test score data, but has there been any more SAT scores or ACT scores as maybe a proxy for college readiness?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a nice way to do it. In the states where I've been working, there's not universal. We could use, did you take the test, I suppose, as a way to do that. It would be great to do it, for instance, in Tennessee, where I've been doing some work on CTE teachers, because the ACT is universally taken there.
I think Connecticut now has, but it'd be just interesting to think about how scores compare to the mobile student, I guess, who's not CTE, and see are they college ready, at least as a proxy for college ready?
That's a great suggestion. And for the cohorts in Connecticut that we can see the longest into the workforce would not have been subject to that. There have been some changes in the application process that make the first stage of our regression discontinuity study a little messier, less ideal in the later cohorts. But I imagine there's something we could do with that. I suspect what we'll find is that there could be some alignment, self-sorting we might find among students, where the incentives to perform might align with the likelihood that they're going to pursue college, notwithstanding that there's probably some good kind of human capital signals we could still pull out of that. So that's a nice idea. In most of the recent work, what we find is if you're in a program that aligns with a college pathway, just the likelihood is much higher. So I was just going to show you empirically, this is data from Massachusetts. At the bottom, you can see that hopefully, well, you probably can't see from very far away, that the key, these are different CTE clusters. So for instance, the purple circle is information technology. It has, students are 13 percentage points more likely to attend any college after high school if they were a concentrator in IT when they were in CTE in high school. Regardless of what sort of high school they went to, more likely to enroll in college. In contrast, all the way to the right, we have construction and transportation, 12 to 15 percentage points less likely to enroll in college immediately after high school. Whether that's good or bad is outside of what I'll debate in this space, but just say that they're predictably different particularly because what we see is most of this loads on two-year colleges. We've got a panel that's four-year colleges in this paper too, but most of the net positive on any college comes from two-year colleges, where there are, in many instances, transfer agreements or articulation agreements where there are pretty clear pathways into college programs.
Are these estimated like causal effects for the subgroup that specializes, or are these raw differences?
So these are conditional on what town you live in, all sort of available demographics, your MCAS scores, net of that being a CTE concentrator compared to students who took some CTE electives. So
you're trying, yes.
we're trying to get there.
Yes.
Yeah, we're trying to get there, but in our RD sample in Connecticut, we've just recently gotten the program participation data, and so we should be able to do something more analogous within program in a more causal framework. Okay, so in New York City, more recently, we've taken this one step further. So not just saying, what's the cluster, and we could do this now in Massachusetts, actually, now that I think of it, but we've said, what's the program of study you're enrolled in? That has a SIP code, academic 6-digit code associated with that. There are crosswalks where we can take that and crosswalk it with occupation codes and say, okay, if you're in this program of study, it aligns with this list of occupations. And then we can take the ONET data from the Department of Labor and say, what's the average amount of training you need to enter that occupation? And we can create school level averages for the programs you offer. How college intensive is it? Does it require just a high school diploma on average, some post-secondary training, or a bachelor's degree or more education? And we find if we characterize the schools based on how aligned their programs are with occupations that require some or a college degree, the schools that offer programs that are more college aligned have a net positive effect on college going. In contrast, schools that have programs that align with direct workforce entry or occupations that require less than a college degree or less than a high school diploma, in some instances, are less likely to enroll in college. And so I think the story here, not to belabor it, is whether or not CTE impacts college going is a function of whether or not the CTE program aligns with a college pathway. But it's not a simple yes or no. Okay, so high school outcomes are better, college goings are sort of pathway specific, earnings are better on average, but it's also more expensive to offer CTE programs. There's a few reasons for this. And so in a working paper with Mary Smith, we start to get into this. And so what I have here are using the NCES F33 district level data for school finance. We estimate the average difference in funding for technical high schools relative to comprehensive high schools in each of these states. We take the raw difference and we multiply it by 4, and then we inflate that across different interest rates. And the result is, except in Pennsylvania, for reasons I can't yet fully describe, but they have a regional model there, and so I have some questions about whether or not we're fully capturing all the costs. CTE is more expensive on average. Okay, so $3,000 to $5,000 more per student per year, averaged across programs. So I can't see program specific costs. Okay, so if it costs more money, it should pay off differently, right? And so we've started to push further there. And this is the slide that probably deserves the most unpacking. So I'll try to do it justice to some degree. What we've done is taken the causal estimates that have been produced studying technical high schools in Massachusetts and Connecticut and said, these are the known benefits to high school graduation. There are estimates of the lifetime value of an additional high school graduate. We take those estimates and we bring them in. We also know what the earnings premia are. And we say, okay, if you are earning this much more at age 18, if we take that and we make that steady for 5 years, and then we smooth it to 0 additional workforce gain by age 45, we combine it with the fraction of additional high school graduates and the additional tax revenue from the higher earnings that we expect that you gain. How does that match up with those additional lifetime costs? And so each of these lines represents the sort of net payoff per student across the working lifetime. So age 18 to 65. The top line is the Massachusetts data where we control for student level differences in enrollment. The reason we control for student level differences in enrollment are because we've got weighted funding formulas in Massachusetts. And so students who come in with certain characteristics, schools get more revenue. And so mechanically, they're going to have more opportunity to spend that and perhaps need to spend that money on things that are related to student characteristics and not educational programs. So with controls in Massachusetts, even under like pretty minimal payoffs of 5%, we see a net payoff. Now, if you don't control for differences in student characteristics, that line shifts down, the dashed gray line, pretty substantially, but still under most reasonable assumptions about the sort of net financial premium for having a CTE training in high school, we see that it pays off. In Connecticut, the effects that we found for initial workforce wage premiums was north of 30%, which the pointer doesn't work, but I'll just, it's around the break-even point here if we assume that all earnings gains go to zero by age 45. Now, we haven't dipped into like negative territory, but I would argue this is a fairly conservative estimate because right now we're not capturing any potential benefits of college going. We're not capturing any potential healthcare benefits or other things that are just beyond reductions in the use of social service programs and higher wages for the first 20 years after high school.
Maybe you're about to get to this, but do you have any sense of where increased costs are coming from? Like, is it smaller classes or material costs?
So a non-trivial, like 30% of the difference seems attributable to classroom size. So in this same paper, we put in the student-teacher ratio, net of accounting for differences in the total enrollment in schools, and see that explains about a third of the total difference. Now, we don't net that out in these cost differences because that's part of the cost of the program, and some of that's explained because for OSHA requirements, you can only have this many people in a room in a advanced manufacturing lab or construction lab. So mechanically, it's required in some settings, and there could be other reasons for it too. So certainly, we expect that there are higher capital costs. We can see some capital spending, but in most of the federal F-33 data, that seems to show up as like school improvements in the infrastructure, and not because there's 5 new lathes, right, in the woodworking lab. So and some of that comes through, anyway, this is getting way in the weeds, but some of those equipment pieces sometimes come through in-kind donations from local employers through partnerships. So having been trained formally in the right way to do the ingredients-based method in cost benefit or cost analysis, we can't do that here, but we're trying to back out best we can on the front end, realizing that there's messiness that we can't fully capture, or we don't fully capture here. Please.
And sorry, this may be a dumb question, but could you just clarify, this is the benefit to the student or to the school district or the local government?
Thanks. So I think this is meant to be the net public benefit. So I think we should frame it from the state standpoint, because we're looking at the reduced expenditures on social service programs and the increase in tax receipts are basically what we can quantify in terms of.
So you're working with other people's estimates of the public value of an additional high school graduate.
That's right.
And then
Yeah,
you're also adding to that the private return to
the
wage
public
increase.
return on the additional.
The public
earnings.
return on the, okay.
Yeah. So if we did the private accounting,
It'd be much
it
more
would be much more beneficial. We're trying to do the public accounting since it's the state and local governments that are making that additional investment in the educational structure. So we're looking at the Levin and Belfield estimates of the value of additional high school graduate over the lifetime, and then adding in the much more modest like additional tax receipts across that time. And I think we're probably underestimating it, but it's pretty conservative, I think. Okay, so it costs more in part because there are more teachers per school. We're trying to expand programs that are in demand, that pay well, but you won't be surprised to learn that programs that pay well for recent high school graduates also pay well for the working adults who are experts in those industries. And it's pretty hard to convince someone to leave their job in healthcare to get paid a pretty standard teaching salary, in place. So we find in some work in Massachusetts that the subject-specific knowledge that prospective teachers demonstrate on their certification exam among CTE teachers, so not like math and reading and writing. In fact, the writing test was not associated with better earnings for the students long-term, but scoring better on your certification exam is associated with better earnings for the students who you teach in the sort of subject-specific area in CTE. There's also some recent work from Washington State done by Roddy Theobald and colleagues that looking at non-test score outcomes for students with disabilities, and found that teachers who had more industry experience, so they had an industry pathway to teaching rather than a traditional teaching pathway, which is required or is the norm in many states for folks who are coming out of programs that don't have a university-based program. So if you're in family and consumer sciences, ag, or business, most states have a traditional pathway to getting a traditional teaching license. If you're in pretty much any other field, there is some sort of occupational or hybrid or industry-based pathway into getting your certification. And so in both of these studies, we were working primarily with teachers who would have come through that sort of occupational or industry-based pathway and find that there are these net benefits to having teachers who had either more experience or demonstrated expertise on their certification exam. However, there's tons of reporting through a variety and earlier stage NCES work, and then some other work by the Student Research Foundation that showed that administrators report that they have either unfilled vacancies or high turnover among CTE teachers, especially in the areas that align with high private sector demand and higher wages, manufacturing, IT, health services, and other STEM fields. The figure at the bottom is breaking out CTE teachers compared to non-CTE teachers and looking at the probability of leaving teaching across the experience continuum, so from 0 to 30 years of experience, and taking out people who are 60 years or older where retirement is on the table, and we don't want to conflate leaving as a function of retirement. But on average, what we see are the sort of red trends and error bars are for CTE teachers. The blue is for non-CTE teachers. And in IT and health science, that's the growth area. Turnover is especially much higher among CTE teachers in the first 5 years and sort of after 25 years. And among trade teachers in the skilled trades, much higher on average. And this is data from Tennessee, where we're conditioning on a whole bunch of things about your previous work experience and where you're teaching, and just mapping out differences in turnover to get a sense with the state administrative data how that lines up with sort of these national reports that turnover is higher. So the bottom line, CTE teachers are important for producing good outcomes for students, at least from a small but growing evidence base, but hard to retain. Okay, so other things to consider beyond the evidence are, because of the extreme policy interest, there's a lot of innovation that's happening in this space. A lot of it's around funding. And so Florida, Georgia, and Kansas increased state funding weights for CTE sort of like globally in recent years. Indiana, Oregon, and Ohio made their funding weights specific to high demand or in demand areas. And so specifically, if you're going into advanced manufacturing, schools will get more funding for students enrolling in those courses, but not if they're enrolling in cosmetology or early childhood education and care. Right, so two different ways that's happening. And then another set of states, partially overlapping with the first set, are paying incentives for industry credential and attainment. So these are things like Cisco systems certifications, also ServSafe certifications if you're in culinary arts and food service, OSHA certifications. There's a wide range of professional certifications. There's relatively little evidence so far, research evidence on kind of whether and how those things pay off. There's not a lot of differentiation in the compensation that schools or the financial incentives attached to these things, just sort of global inducements to do more of this. I don't have any sort of good evidence one way or the other at this point of like how or whether these things are playing out, but these are things to watch for. These are in response to sort of overall greater emphasis on CTE and not necessarily happening in ways that are fully aligned with the research evidence that I've laid out so far. So I suppose I'm making some sort of evaluative judgments on that fact, but in general, policy has to move faster than research. And these are things, these are going to be opportunities to learn about whether and how these things produce the intended outcomes.
Shaun, in your judgment, how well are the states that are going in that direction doing in picking the right fields, right? I mean, isn't that always the challenge here is, will the government policymaker make the right choices about which fields are going to be hot, not just now, but in a few years, because these things, schools are going to make investments in programs based on the current incentives. So.
Yeah, so I've not analyzed that closely yet. I would say my understanding, the way most states are doing this, is that they're looking at like Department of Labor employment forecasts. They're consulting with their state level folks and looking at employer investments to try to do local projections, which is what the new Perkins reauthorization is asking them to do.
That's what we owe workforce board to. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Though I can't remember, I don't want to like misattribute the comment, but someone somewhat recently I heard comment on the fact that if you look at what the projections are and how they're realized over time, we haven't done a great job over the last 50 years of getting that right. And so I think that's part of the policy challenges, right? Is like we're trying to scale offerings that we think are effective and in demand, while also being mindful of the fact that the target is going to move. And what we can see, I don't have slides for this, in the teacher data from Tennessee is, if you look over time, as new programs are growing, let's say in health service and IT, you do see declines in other areas like business or family and consumer science teachers, but teachers have long careers on average, despite the fact that there's high turnover. In some areas, on average, teachers have long careers, and you can't quickly turn an FCS teacher into an IT teacher. And so, you know, scaling offerings, getting the content right, finding out ways of being responsive to changes in the market, I think is like a fundamental challenge. But given that we're seeing this shift and increased investment in CTE now, it seems like this is a good time to maybe rethink kind of how we set the parameters of that policy. So, you know, we know that content and industry knowledge are important on the teacher side, but we also know that we're competing with relatively high wage, high demand sectors to try and pull people into teaching or retain them in teaching, and kind of getting this content right, making sure we have the equipment and space to sort of scale this correctly is a challenge. So this is more of a wish list than like I've got evidence that each one of these would be the way to go. But in thinking about where to go and potential policy solutions, you know, I'd like to see incentives attached more to things that we know are likely to produce good impacts, whether that's in the model of schooling or elements of those models of schooling, so that we have a reasonable expectation that a new program or expansions of existing programs will produce similar impacts. I think there's a need to do more secondary, post-secondary collaboration in this space. For instance, I learned in Tennessee, where we've got fantastic technical colleges, that most of the CTE programs that are offered there are offered during the working day, same as the local high schools are offering them. And so right now there's no structure to take the same subject matter expertise and see if you could share that knowledge across secondary and post-secondary settings. Kentucky's been pretty innovative in this space, thinking about scaling dual credit or dual enrollment opportunities based at community colleges, where space and equipment can be concentrated, but then you can also serve, especially in rural communities, a broader swath of students in ways that capitalize on the same instructors, the same equipment, and the same space. You know, I think there's also opportunities to scale lower cost programs, business, IT, things that are less space or equipment intensive that can be done in comprehensive high schools. thinking about ways of locating those lower cost programs in places where it'll increase access. Or alternatively, try to bundle high and low cost programs in regional technical centers so that you don't bear the brunt of having really expensive programs that might make them prohibitively expensive. If you can co-locate programs, there might be ways to smooth costs. I would argue that some of the cost differential might be higher for regional technical high schools if we didn't have some low-cost programs co-located with the higher cost programs. And of course, I'm inferring higher costs based on equipment intensivity and space restrictions, but I don't think that that's out of bounds. And then innovative staffing models, I think too, that if we're asking people who are experts in their industry to leave their full-time job in industry to be a teacher, I think some folks are clearly willing to and able to do that. Many don't leave. However, if we're going to scale these offerings, I don't think that there's a, general equilibrium is that there's like a ton of, we have a lot of margin for movement here. And so I think that we need to think about maybe more creative models for staffing, teaching in that space, or certainly it's a time that's worth thinking about it. And then whether or not there are other ways to try to tighten the connections between industry and education. There are some good models, but they thinking about having them operate at scale might include, creating financial incentives for businesses to either employ students, donate equipment, create job, more substantial work-based learning engagement opportunities, things of that nature that again, as we're thinking about expanding, scaling CTE, these are things that could be experimented with in addition to just, changing the per pupil funding allocation. Please.
Do we have clarity on demand on the side of like from a state level, regional level, and as a whole within these programs, but then even more specific, which subsector?
So, so in general, demand has been growing, let's say, in the last decade, whereas in the previous decade it was not. But there is regional difference, right? So even within Massachusetts, there are some communities where the demonstrated demand from the student side well exceeds the capacity at the regional technical high schools. However, you don't have to go that far and you find communities where demand is at or below capacity. That's it for like a schooling model. In terms of like content specific knowledge or program offerings in work that I didn't feature here, but that's a part of our multi-state lab studying CTE. We see that what school you enroll in really restricts kind of whether or not you can enroll in a particular program. So most of the differences we see in who enrolls in what program are explained by whether or not their school has it on the list. So I don't know if that quite gets it.
There's not really an accurate mechanism right now. We think finding out what students actually have interest in within CTE.
I think that's right. I think that in the models in Massachusetts and Connecticut, the regional technical high schools, in 9th grade, students get to explore over, like, let's say 3 to 6 different programs of study, and then they rank their preferences. The schools talk about how they match up in terms of skills and interests, and then they get matched. So there is a matching mechanism that happens there, net of having already enrolled in those schools. In a comprehensive high school setting, it's more like if you took an elective course and it resonated with you, you could take another one. If it didn't, there's not and that's like a semester or year-long commitment typically to find out. Whereas in this exploratory model, it's like 4 to 6 weeks, and then you move to the next one, and then you do some wholesale reassessing.
Hey, Shaun. First of all, is this your last slide?
It was. I think it had.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. First of all, thank you.
Yeah.
Really appreciate that. And obviously want to open up to questions, folks in the room, as well as folks online. I don't know if we've been getting anything in the chat, but please put your questions in there if you've got any. One quick question just to start us off is, it seems like a lot of the research and a lot of the findings relate to, for lack of a better word, full implementation career technical programs. One of the questions, and this may relate to the costs and the staffing constraints, is do you have a hypothesis, or does the data suggest that it's possible to do sort of CTE light or a different model that's a little bit less capital intensive, maybe a little bit less involving sort of, for example, 1 week on, 1 week off models where you're 1 week you're in class, the next week you're in a shop, but it's a little bit more maybe integrated, a little bit more, for lack of a better word, low cost, low capital intensive, and maybe low expertise intensive as well on the staffing, that potentially can produce similar results? Or is it really, you got to go all in? And that there's Pioneer Institute and folks may be on the line here. They have a book recently called Hands-on Achievement. I think their hypothesis tends to be you kind of got to go all in and do the full model, or else you don't get the gains. Any thoughts on that?
Sure. So I'll say this, like acknowledging that I'll get like way out over my skis in terms of what I can support with evidence, but also couch it in. I was a high school teacher and administrator. I was a liaison to our regional technical center in southeastern Pennsylvania. And so like I'm couching this some in my practice-based experience too. A challenge to doing this, I think, well in a comprehensive high school setting are the like range of other incentives and tensions that get created there. The number one thing that dictated what we did in my high school that I learned from an administrative standpoint, and that I know is the case for my brother, who's a principal in New York, is the schedule. And I think to do this well, you need to have the math and reading or English teachers talking to the technical education teachers and having some coordination of curricula, assignments, or at least awareness of what's happening. I would argue having a stable set of teachers for your CTE courses and then creating like a multi-year mentorship model and maybe even a stable cohort of peers with whom you're like learning and developing longitudinally. In principle, all that should be possible in a comprehensive high school. But my practice-based experience tells me that it's hard to do. I think with the sort of right orientation and creative thinking, I think it's possible, right? I was at a very large high school. We had 30 math teachers. If you had a subset of those math teachers that were sort of cohorted with a group of students who are all in a cohort of a technical program, you could probably create some continuity without totally disrupting the schedule, provided you were, able to take that liberty from a scheduling standpoint. I think also having meaningful connection with employers requires serious engagement with employers and designating some human capital to be responsible for doing that. Is it possible in a comprehensive high school? Definitely, but it's not sort of the modal behavior. And so I think what it would take is having someone who knows how to do technical education well, having some serious like responsibility and influence on how the comprehensive high school is run.
Right. Thank you.
Any other questions?
This is a terrible question, and I'm sorry to ask this, but in terms of like, how would you, so this is really helpful in terms of understanding CTE specifically, but I'm curious about like vocational training programs and then like Job Corps and those sorts of programs that students can elect to join after high school. Like how does the evidence compare for CTE versus those sorts of programs that are post high school?
I think it's a great question. You can tell me later why you thought it was a terrible question. I mean, so maybe it's like, are you thinking about could those be substitutes? Like why put? Gotcha. So I myself have gotten increasingly interested in programs offered at community colleges and programs like Job Corps that are doing arguably comparable training or trying to create the same credential attainment, right? Preparation for occupations. I would argue one of the benefits of CTE that I didn't fully articulate here is creating attachment to school. Like we still don't graduate 1 out of 7 students. And it's wildly variable by district, but if we can make school more meaningful, create attachment, relevance, like there's value there that isn't just about preparation for occupation, though it might still serve 2 purposes. The second piece is like, I think they can be, I don't know the literature as well enough to say like the point estimates here are like, similar to here. One challenge with the evidence that I've helped produce is that a lot of it's regression discontinuity work. And so I can tell you the estimate for the marginal admitted student, whereas with the Job Corps, if we're going to have an RCT, I'm going to have the average treatment effect. I'd have to think a little bit harder, not only about how the magnitudes map up, but what I think they mean in those but I think of these as like complementary things, right? Because if I'm at a comprehensive high school and I, in my last year of high school, find out I'm really excited about advanced manufacturing, or I want to be a solar installation technician, I could go to a Job Corps program and then get the additional training that I need to go into those aligned occupations, which, you know, is also a different way of thinking about the like suite of post high school options, I think.
Do we have any online questions? We should see what's in the chat.
There was one question about a specific slide earlier, and the CPE percentages that you displayed, national or state.
Those were national. That's like the best aggregate estimates, but they're going to be wildly different by state. So for instance, Massachusetts, we don't have regional technical centers. Most of the Northeast, until you hit Pennsylvania, doesn't have the regional model. Oh, sorry, it doesn't have the part-time regional model. They've got full-time schools or comprehensive high schools. So those averages mask a lot of the variation.
By the way, just on that point, so presumably the regional centers, students have to travel from wherever their high school is to get there after school, after regular school hours or in the afternoons or something like that. We actually have started a program here in Massachusetts for after hours, Chapter 74 vocational programs, where students who are not enrolled in a regional school travel to that school at the end of the school day and do their shop classes on site at those places, which now turns them into sort of a hybrid whole school model and regional technical center.
Yeah, it's a great way to capitalize right on otherwise be potentially underutilized capacity, especially given the space constraints and enrollment constraints that folks face. And if you have disengaged youth or out of school youth who are looking back to get credentials, complete their high school equivalency or get a diploma, there's models in Indiana that I think Goodwill maybe has been a part of this in creating comparable programs that kind of piece this all together.
It also leverages faculty, because the faculty, the technical faculty, and Liz Ben is here. It's a way to earn more money. They seem to like it, like the extra hours. It's not like it's a burden in some ways. So that's, has some value on that front as well.
Yeah, I actually had my conversations with Liz in that mind when I was inquiring in Tennessee, because I thought, if you could get staff that can expand, not that people have an infinite number of hours that they want to be working, but conditional on being willing to do it, it's a nice way to capitalize on those resources.
So, a couple questions. One, universities in areas where faculty increasingly have high earning opportunities outside of the academy, like biotech and the like, have been creative in trying to create opportunities for faculty to have, half-time appointments that allow them to continue their professional opportunities. Are there any examples of doing anything like that, where you might be able to have a part-time teaching role or a job sharing teaching role? Because it seems like there are probably a lot of professionals in these high demand areas who might value participating, just not in a full-time way in these programs. They might even see them as a way to find talent and see them as something that could be beneficial for the work side. Or are our contracts and pay scales too rigid for that?
So I'm inclined to answer with just agreeing that I think that the constraints of the contracts might be. However, like Scott Walker got rid of all credentialing requirements for CTE teachers in 2010 or 11 in Wisconsin, and I don't know if that led to, creative models like that. It changed whether or not you needed even this industry and business pathway. But I think, well, yes, he did. I think, right. So it would also be hard to tease out what's moving what needle. But I don't know of staffing models like what you're talking about at the university level. I would love to find them, because to me, there could be some also returns to specialization. So for instance, I have seen small scale qualitative studies that have talked to CTE teachers in health science who left, or in IT that left. And it was around things for that folks who go to teacher education programs learn how to do expertly, like classroom management or navigate all of the social dimensions of how schools operate, but they don't have the technical expertise, or they don't know how to weld, right? So if you could pull together the technical expertise with some of the like school specific management pieces. It seems like there should be some returns to those models. I just haven't seen examples of them.
So Europe has different systems than we do here in the United States, and particularly in Italy. At least years ago, there were divisions in high school where you went to the classical, you went to the technical, you went to the business, and the private industry got some benefit by sort of rotating some of their employees through sort of like we do as a sabbatical.
Yeah.
And they would go work at the school for a year, knowing that they'd actually get the summer off and other benefits, but then they'd go back to their employer. The employer would get something and also recruit people. So the system was all baked in.
And like we've got creative staff models in terms of like Teach for America or other intern teaching programs where the model isn't the idea that you're producing necessarily teachers for 30 years. You could have some sort of rotational model where you partner with industry. I know of employers in the US that give their technically sophisticated workers like sabbatical years. You could create, yeah, it's not impossible. There are good models to follow. Sorry, was to do the question.
Thinking about, I've worked with in middle schools in the past where you're kind of supporting students through like the high school selection process in many places like New York. And I'm thinking about some parents who almost were offended when CTE was like presented to them as an option for their students, and kind of this stigma that it was almost a value judgment of what their student was capable of. I'm curious your opinions on like this change. Have you seen changes in that stigma, and how would you respond to a parent with those feelings?
So optimist in me would say I've seen some changes in the sort of stigma as the like list of things that is included under the CTE umbrella have expanded. Oftentimes people respond with surprise, like, oh, I didn't know information technology was, you know, CTE or engineering or health services, right? That like fully support their children pursuing nursing as a career, didn't think about CTE as a complementary pathway to their academic development or social development. And you can still see massively classed patterns. And I'm like using class in a pretty blunt way, but like I can use the town's median family income to predict the share of CTE concentrators in Massachusetts pretty tightly, right? And so, you know, things have been changing. There is less stigma attached as people think of the breadth of CTE, but it's not the same. What I would tell parents is, and what I talk to my children about is, you want school to be an interesting and engaging experience. There are certain things you need to do to give yourself options about what you want to do later. Net of that, like it's for you to explore and gain experience. And just because you studied something for 3 years in high school or in college doesn't commit you to a lifetime of doing that. But you should, you know, take a look and try some things out. But also be cognizant of like the strengths and limitations of those respective pathways, whether you're pursuing accounting or whether you're pursuing plumbing, right? That's like.
This is the selfish related to my own research agenda.
Please.
But I'm curious, I mean, especially because in Massachusetts and other places, like the presence of these programs is correlated with the socioeconomic demographics. Like I've been talking with some people in Lowell who are trying to start like teacher vocational education programs in Lowell high schools to prepare students to enter teacher certification pathways in college. And part of the goal of starting those programs in those areas is like diversifying the teaching profession in the state. And so I'm curious, like in these other fields, have vocational education programs helped to diversify professions that might otherwise be more like class segregated?
Gosh, so I'm not sure that I can, like, I'm sure that I can't point to great examples. I can point, like in the Tennessee data, we see a lot more Black health science teachers in Nashville and Memphis, but we also have much larger Black populations in Memphis and Nashville in ways that are about like the, you know, being in large communities that are also more racially diverse have better success at producing teachers that look like the student population. That said, in terms of like CTE specific pathways, there have been some programs that I learned about in Tennessee that have had, I think, mixed success in trying to create industry pathways from industry into teaching, that some of them are specifically around diversifying the teaching pool. One was a partnership with Tennessee State with an HBCU in Metro Nashville to try to help smooth the transition. That program, I think, then got authorized to more Chattanooga area, but I know of some the really small scale from of the ones that I know of, but there are, you know, some efforts to do that.
So we're getting close to the end. I got one quick question, maybe not a quick answer, but if there's one more question, I think we could probably handle that as well. One thing that's distinctive about CTE is they tend to be choice programs and choice schools. And so I guess one question is, have you been able to sort of tease out the extent to which the choice factor itself contributes to the outcomes you're seeing, or whether you can sort of screen that out? And because in some cases you may not be dealing with, you know, those who applied, you may not be looking at those who applied and those who got in and didn't get in. You're just looking at sort of paired students based on their demographics or other factors. So any sense for either what the research might say about that or what it could, and whether the choice element of it, you know, is potentially important?
So knowing what we know about like adolescent development, I think it's pretty easy to imagine that having a choice is beneficial because self-determination is like so crucial to positive adolescent development. So like the perception that you have the ability to make some positive choice about where you're going to go, whether you actually know if one's better or not, I imagine psychologically is affirming. So there has been a question in our mind in these regression discontinuity studies where you have, you know, the last person in compared to the first person out. Like, is there a negative psychic impact of not getting the thing that you wanted? And we've done a little, we're going to do more in Connecticut because we have a much larger sample, where you look at the students who applied and didn't get in, do they still show up in CTE programs? And it's way below 100%. You know, how much of that is like interest change versus the aligned programs that were of interest to them aren't offered? We can't quite tease that out, at least not in the aggregate quantitative data. But I think that's probably some dimension of this, is the ability to choose or have options. The other piece that I'll add here, where I have opportunities to do analysis but haven't done them yet, are we see students applying to technical high schools in both Massachusetts and Connecticut out of like charter schools, parochial schools, other private schools that are for, you know, middle school. Some of them were never in the public sector. Some of them don't show up in the public sector in high school. And so there's also this element of, you know, choice operating in the background that we don't perfectly observe, that I think deserves some more exploration too.
I'll make one observation related to choice. It gives a chance to talk about one of your successors at HCC in our doctoral program now, Mikko Silliman. Do you know his work? So he has this nice paper in Finland on vocational education, where they're able to, in complicated ways, study the effects of being in a vocational rather than a academic oriented program, and get the effects on earnings and labor market outcomes. And he finds that some of the people who get into a vocational program like wanted to be there relative to an academic program. Others would have preferred the academic program, and the effects are much bigger for those that wanted to be there, much bigger and more positive. And so it suggests that choice is part of what's going, or that people know the extent to which they would be a good fit for one track or the other.
I didn't know that nuance of Mikko's work. I know the work. In fact, some of his own machinations around how to think about whether the payoff at age 30 is like, you know, how do we think about that across the rest of the life cycle?
But his evidence is more encouraging on that point than some of the other evidence.
Definitely, and that was part of what motivated my own work on thinking about is there a net public benefit in the US context, conditional on only being able to see people to like age 27 so far.
So Shaun, any closing remarks or thoughts before we end?
I mean, it sounds like a number of folks in the room are already engaged in doing this work, whether it's on the practice side or the research side. there's plenty of work to be done. And so I'm hoping, there'll be continued engagement around the scholarship, but also around the public element, public policy element, engaging with state and local folks to innovate and study. So thanks for the chance to share
Well,
this.
thank you again. Thank you so much.